Hi. We get asked a lot of licensing questions about ArcaOS, so I'm hoping that this may provide some useful information for everyone. This session also includes some planned features regarding licensing issues specific to ArcaOS 5.1, and as with all information about unreleased products, these are projections that have not been set as policy yet. I'm Louis Rosenthal, managing member of ArcaOS. Most of you probably know who I am already, but if not, you may surely look me up on the About page of the ArcaOS website or on my personal blog at 2rosenthals.net/WordPress. The ArcaOS license is really a collection of licenses, but all are really limited by the one binding common factor, the IBM Warp 4 End User License Agreement. Bear in mind that IBM came up with that license in a different era, and just because we were able to arrange an application services license with IBM to allow us to include Warp 4, or more specifically MCP2, as a core component of ArcaOS, does not mean that IBM expanded the Warp 4 EULA in any way. It is what it is, and it is beyond our capability to update it. In the days of Warp Server for eBusiness, SMP support was an add-on component which could only be added onto Warp Server and not Warp 4, or, in current IBM parlance, the Warp 4 client. In the case of ArcaOS, however, we made special arrangements to be able to include the SMP kernel with all ArcaOS editions. There is no separate license for this component. It is covered by the IBM license and specifically restricted, as we'll discuss later, to use with ArcaOS. On top of these base components, we add ArcaOS specific components, which either have their own licenses or are covered under the main ArcaOS license. These components, for example HiDisk, the RAM disk configurator, may only be used on ArcaOS products. Next, we have our separately licensed device drivers, which are generally covered under one or more separate proprietary licenses, some of which have multiple uses. ACPI, for example, is licensed for use on ArcaOS, and if licensed separately as part of the proper subscription, for use on ECS and Warp 4 as well. In some cases, non-ArcaOS permitted use may be more or less restrictive than ArcaOS permitted use. It's really necessary to read the licensing for the component. Finally, we have a mix of other proprietary and open source licensed components, DragText, Samba, Firefox, Lucid, and so forth. Non-proprietary licensed components may be moved about freely from ArcaOS to other distributions. Proprietary software has been licensed for exclusive use with ArcaOS. DragText, Sigma, and the DFC engine are three good examples. Let's define what we mean by license editions. In terms of use, the personal edition is surely okay to use in a business environment. However, the thing to remember is that in business, you probably do not want to have to wait for an answer to an urgent support request. So, while the licensing is fine, the support may not be at a level which is commensurate with the need. The personal edition also includes only 6 months of support instead of a full year, so you'll have a renewal sooner than you might expect. Likewise, the commercial edition may surely be used outside of a business setting. Of course, it does come with upgraded support. Commercial tickets are prioritized over personal ones, particularly during periods of heavy activity, such as when new releases drop and people may have installation issues. Other than that, these editions may be legally used for any lawful purpose. Both editions are individually metered. We'll discuss what we mean by metering next. Let's start by defining what we mean by license metering for bare metal. That's physical workstations, servers, notebooks, and tablets. To start, one license is legally valid for one physical machine. That machine may have a dozen bootable ArcaOS installations on it, but in actuality, only one may be booted and operating at any given time. So long as this is the case, only a single ArcaOS license is needed for a single machine. Note that I'm not talking about a single machine acting as a hypervisor running VirtualBox with an ArcaOS host and one or more ArcaOS guests here. Those booted guests are considered separate machines, as we'll discuss next. The hypervisor machine itself, however, will only require one license. Are there valid reasons for installing the same ArcaOS license on multiple systems? Yes. if you are evaluating different hardware, motherboards for example, it is entirely possible that you may perform one install, have an issue, open a ticket, and at some point decide that perhaps you should just install the license on a different system. This is fine, so long as you go back at some point in the near future and erase the initial installation so as to render it non-bootable. Remember, simply having files on a disk drive is not a license violation. It is the ability to simultaneously boot multiple installations where we run into issues. So evaluate all you want, so long as the process is not overly extended. Evaluating for 5 years and switching between 4 systems in the process is not evaluation, obviously. If we ask, as we may, just explain why you happen to have 2 systems with the same ArcaOS license reported in different tickets in the bug tracker. Now, virtual machines are a little different. Remember that when IBM drafted the Warp 4 EULA, virtual machines on PCs were practically unheard of as we know them today. Obviously, virtual DOS machines running under OS/2 qualify as virtual machines, just like Java virtual machines are virtual machines. But these are not what we think of today when we are discussing virtual machines. For VMs, the number of ArcaOS licenses must equal the number of simultaneously booted and running ArcaOS installations running under all hypervisors across all physical machines. So, assume you have 4 VMware servers, each hosting 4 ArcaOS VMs, which boot and run concurrently. We count these as 16 licenses. Now, let's say you keep a hot spare for each of those 4 physical machines in case the existing host has a hardware failure. As long as none of those backup copies are in use at the same time as their primary ones, the ones running on the failed machine, no additional licenses are required, as there should never be more than 16 ArcaOS VMs running simultaneously. The important point to remember is that creating a VM does not trigger the use of a license. It is booting that VM which does, and as VMs are not license specific, shutting down one VM and bringing up another afterward does not increase the in-use license count. So each concurrently running VM requires 1 license. Side trip. The OS/2 and ECS drivers and software subscription is valid for non-ArcaOS systems only. So while the components may be dual licensed for use with ArcaOS, ACPI for example, allowing the ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription to lapse, and instead keeping in force the drivers and software subscription just to save a few bucks, will result in no support for such dual licensed components when installed on the unlicensed OS, as it is a license violation for installing those components on ArcaOS when acquired as part of a non-compliant subscription. Non-compliant meaning not an ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription. For non-ArcaOS systems, most ArcaNoA components in the drivers and software personal subscription are licensed for up to 5 non-ArcaOS systems. For ArcaOS systems, the same components, when provided under a valid ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription, are licensed for the same number of ArcaOS installations as have valid subscriptions. That's 1-to-1. For the commercial OS/2 and ECS drivers and software subscription, metering is always 1-to-1. One subscription covers 1 station or 1 VM. In contrast, this is what we have with the ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription. As mentioned, content provided here is only licensed for use with ArcaOS, even though these may be the same binary packages as those included in the OS/2 and ECS drivers and software subscription. Further, if more ArcaOS licenses were originally purchased than subscriptions currently active, Content from those active subscriptions may only be utilized by and receive support for the ArcaOS installations associated with the licenses having such active support. So, if you license ArcaOS for stations A, B, C, and D, and later only renew support for stations C and D, the two later ones, you may not install subscription-provided updates on stations A and or B, the two earlier ones which have already expired. Those installations remain frozen in time insofar as their licensing is concerned. You may surely continue to use them as they were, and at the code level, last available when they still had valid support and maintenance, but that's the extent of it. Finally, here, as I mentioned earlier, none of this content is licensed for use on non-ArcaOS systems, and no support will be provided on those systems when the content was obtained through a non-compliant subscription. The kernel is a mix of licensing and restrictions, and our support is very specific in terms of what we consider valid or invalid in order to have us address a particular problem. Let's break this down a bit. First, as mentioned earlier, the kernel is licensed only for use on ArcaOS. It is specifically not part of the OS2 and ECS drivers and software subscription. Remember what I said about the SMP kernel and IBM's licensing? Even the single-core W4 or Warp4 kernel is considered part of ArcaOS and covered under IBM's Warp4 EULA. OS2 kernel is the kernel file itself. OS2 loader and friends constitute the loader, which is specific to ArcaOS, not IBM's loader, though in earlier releases of ArcaOS, single-core installations did use the IBM loader. OS2 dump is the dumper for producing trap dumps. This is now an ArcaNoA component, replacing IBM's older, more limited one, which had no prompt to this one has no prompt to insert floppies when no dump partition has been defined, and many more options for the dump partition. OS2 boot is specific to the file system being used for the system volume, either HBFS or JFS. There are other kernel-specific files. doscol1.dll comes to mind. These are operating system files, however, and as such are covered under the ArcaOS license. Certain capabilities of the ACPI PSD are available only when used with the ArcaOS kernel, and certain capabilities are only available for SMP systems. None of these components, when distributed with ArcaOS or as part of a valid ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription, are licensed for use on any other OS2 distribution. Continuing. Support is expressly denied for any non-ArcaOS supplied kernel components or for ArcaOS supplied kernel components when used in conjunction with non-ArcaOS supplied kernel components. So, if you want to use XYZ's OS2 dump on your system hangs when dumping, that's not our problem to address. We know nothing of these third-party components and do not test with them. If you can reproduce a problem with all ArcaOS supplied kernel components and you have active support, we will surely discuss your issue. PSDs work in much the same way in that we will require you to switch to a supported ArcaOS PSD in order to troubleshoot a problem. We do not provide support for components which we do not provide with ArcaOS, or where the component is provided with ArcaOS, but only as a convenience feature, whether support is available elsewhere or not. Let's talk about updates for a minute. We've had a number of people, when a new ArcaOS maintenance release has been dropped, purchase a brand new ArcaOS license. If you already have an active ArcaOS support and maintenance subscription for the same major and minor version, for example 5.0, you are already entitled to download the latest 5.0 release as part of your subscription content. simply click the link in the Order Details page from your customer portal to request a fresh ISO. There is no need to purchase another ArcaOS license with every maintenance release. Now, when ArcaOS 5.1 ships, this is a different minor version, and as such, 5.1 will require an upgrade purchase. Pricing has not been set, but expect this to be a steep discount over purchasing a new ArcaOS license. Support for 5.0 will not be going away, but rather, we will add another channel specific to ArcaOS 5.1. There may be different components between 5.0 and 5.1, and we may continue to update the 5.0 components for some time while we update separate components for 5.1. An upgrade to 5.1 will terminate 5.0 support for the license being upgraded and convert that to 5.1 support. So some of you with multiple systems and licenses may end up with some ArcaOS 5.0 and 5.1 systems for a while, with different updates available from different subscriptions. Licensing for multiple languages brings about its own set of unique points. As with the previous mention of 5.1 licensing, none of this has been made official as of yet, but this is how we currently see it working out. ArcaOS licensing will remain, as it has been, major-minor version specific. This means that licenses are language agnostic, so one license is good for one ArcaOS installation in any language. Customers will have the ability to request and to download the ISO of their choice from their subscription downloads, and all languages will remain available in the subscription content list. As we add more languages, these will become available as subscription downloads as well, so long as the added language has been released for the same major-minor version as the customer's active support and maintenance subscription. We don't get this question often, but it came up just the other day, so I thought I'd add it here. ArcaOS licenses are transferable. This is covered in paragraph 9 of the ArcaOS EULA. Essentially, the transferor must provide proof of entitlement to the transferee. The transferor must then notify ArcaNoe of the license being transferred along with contact details of the transferee. Any active support and maintenance subscription will transfer with the ArcaOS license to the transferee. The transferor will no longer be licensed to use the product or access downloads or support for that license, though he or she may have active subscriptions for other licenses which will remain unaffected. I can now take any questions you may have. I'm sure I didn't cover all aspects here, so fire away.
And we're live.
Yeah?
Yeah, you're live.
Am I? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there I am. I get a delay when I look at the YouTube stream when I'm live here. So I got a question about will a single test log support both 5.0 and 5.1? Most likely, it hasn't really been determined, but since the test log program works even with Warp 4, I don't see why it wouldn't work with 5.1. This session, of course, is specific to licensing issues. So we have any other licensing questions? No license. Everyone's a license whiz.
Yeah.
There's no tie-in to the hardware itself. Unlike Windows licensing, where if you upgrade a component and then you have to re-register your product, we don't do any of that nonsense. So for us, it's still on the old-fashioned honor system. We also don't consider that changing your hard drive constitutes a change of machine. It's good to almost see you too, Jan. Yeah, it's good to be here with everyone. I'm really glad we were able to bring this this WarpSock event together.
There is a good question. They say the ISOs are built per user. How we will deal with transfers, with license transfers?
Well, this is why we need the information on the transferee, because what we're going to want to do is ensure that the transferee has an account, and then we're going to have to, on the back end, move that license from one account to the other. Well, not the entire user account. The entire user account does not get transferred, only that license. So for instance, let's say that a particular user has 5 ArcaOS licenses and sells a machine of his on eBay along with the ArcaOS license. So we would only transfer that one license over to the new owner. And no new ISO would be well. The new owner could then download a new ISO. He'll have the old personalization information until his next update. At that point, he'll get new information. Does that answer the question?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
License transferring is not very common on the software world. It's well, it is. I found it kind of interesting to have that on ArcaOS.
Well, yeah, it's not something that we see all the time. It sort of came about in our planning because sometimes companies sell, and the company may have 100 ArcaOS licenses, and we want to make sure that we have a provision to be able to transfer those to a new owner of the company. And if we're going to do that, then we should be able to do that for individual owners as well. Licensees, I should say.
Yes, that's right. I have seen that when one company buys another, yeah, the licenses are transferred, but not for individuals. That is kind of different, yeah. And good, yeah.
Now, frankly, from our perspective, we would prefer to sell new licenses, but that's not the fair way to handle this. And we'd rather be fair with everyone. eBay, here we come. That was sort of the question that was posed to me about someone putting together a system as a hobby. And he said, could I buy a license secondhand? And I said, well, yeah, if you can find one, but most people who buy them don't sell them. Everyone really likes to hang on to them. Any specific license for someone who would want to procure ArcaOS services, sell ArcaOS related products? Take Blonde Guy, for example. What resellers get, not for resale licenses, NFR licenses for their own use, and resellers also get commercial support with that. So if you sign up to resell, then you get a few perks along the way.
And there is another question there that say from YouTube, from the YouTube chat, is the email from ArcaOS a valid proof of entitlement? Is well, I'm not sure if I get it right.
The email order receipt is a valid proof of entitlement when the recipient of that email hands that to the transferee. Yes. I mean, if I were to send someone else's email that I intercepted, well, then that really wouldn't have much bearing. But if it's my own email with me as the customer, then that proves that I did place the order and receive the goods. Yeah, I think we're probably done with this, but I'll be on for a while. So if anyone has any questions, just post them and I'll respond as I can. Terrific.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis.
Bye. See everyone later.